Welcome back to Ridge Talk this week. Got Daniel and Justin with me, and we're just going to jump right into our first question here. Not even going to ask you guys how you're doing.
I'm good, though.
I'm great.
Thanks for asking.
So here's the first question that we got. It was actually submitted to us months ago, but then it came up recently in a sermon and thought it provided a little bit better context. So we're going to let you answer this one today.
I'll do it. Yeah.
Here's the question. Came from actually a teenager in our congregation, and they said, I just finished studying angelology in school. I typically use the King James Version, and something that I learned is that in the Old Testament, when the Bible mentions the angel of the Lord, it is thought to refer to a theophany. In Matthew 28:2, it says, And behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. In the ESV, it also refers to the angel of the Lord. And so here's their question. How is it possible for the angel of the Lord to come down from heaven to roll away the stone if he was buried in the tomb? Or is it that he'd already risen but just wanted to roll away the stone for others? I know that he is omnipotent and omnipresent. Also, a theophany is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, but this is obviously occurring after he came to earth. And so they just wanted a little bit more clarity about kind of that idea. First of all, I think of theophanies. Do we think that when the Old Testament talks about the angel of the Lord, if that is Jesus coming to earth? And then what we think is that, I think if I'm putting that together, then it would be, is it every time that we see that term angel of the Lord, is that always referring to Jesus, or might there be some nuance in there or some different understanding? So I'm going to kick that over to you because you're the lead pastor and you get paid to answer the hard questions.
Okay. I'll say a couple of things before I get to that. I'll say one, that's a great question. I appreciate questions like that, very thought-provoking, and from someone so young, studying angelology in school, so that's great. The other thing I'll say is, so a little bit more backstory. So this question, on Easter Sunday of this year, the reason it's asking about the stone being rolled away and all that, the reason it was being asked that way, we started Ridge Talk the week of Easter, and that question was asked week 1, and I responded back like, hey, I didn't really bring that up, and so we're not going to answer that question. I gave a brief answer there in an email to her, but I mentioned it explicitly, the concept of theophanies and Christophanies, very recently when we talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And so I actually went back and said, hey, you should resubmit that question so we can answer it. So that's why it's coming back up again all these months later. I think I don't remember if I said this on Sunday or not. The term, there's two terms that are theological terms that people use, theologians use. Theophany, which is just, it's two words coming together. It's theos and phaineia, and then Christophany, Christos and phaineia. It's phaineia means appearance, so it's an appearance of God or an appearance of Christ. And so we see these throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, by the way. There are, you think about, there are Christophanies after Christ has, ascended. We see, for instance, him appearing to Paul on the road to Damascus. And so we'll see things like that. So there are times throughout the scriptures where it explicitly says that God visited with someone, that God met someone. So an example of a theophany that wouldn't necessarily be a Christophany is in Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah, it doesn't say he's having a vision. It says he beheld God. He had a visit from God. He's there in the throne room having this experience with God. You see it at various other points. And sometimes... So another example would be Abraham. Most people think when he's visited by the three visitors right before Sodom and Gomorrah, that's another example of a theophany, potentially a Christophany. But then there are times throughout the scriptures where you see people interacting with another human-like figure, but also the language kind of lets you know this person is different. This is not a normal person. So examples that you would see of this would be, I think, by the way, I said it on Sunday, I'll say it again. We don't know.
Yeah.
It might be a little more than conjecture, but it's less than explicit.
There's
it's
not consensus on it.
There is not consensus on this. But look, we hold to a Trinitarian view, and which means that Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, the Son, existed before he was born on earth, born to Mary. And so we know he existed even before creation, and that he indeed was part of creation. He was the one through whom all things were made. But then you see these instances, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then the fourth, like one of the sons of God.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of language, you see it with Jacob wrestling with God. He names the place Peniel, meaning face of God. I've seen the face of God.
Yeah, because doesn't it, the language, if I recall correctly, it says that the angel of the Lord visited him, but then in Jacob's own words, he says, I wrestled with God.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes, it is. You see it again with Joshua. Joshua is visited by the angel of the Lord.
Yeah.
I believe Gideon is also visited by the angel of the Lord. You see it happening in Judges and Joshua quite a bit. There's another really big example that I just had. Another one with Abraham is Melchizedek.
Yeah.
Many people, it's a very unique figure that the author of Hebrews tells us more about. But you see two things. Melchizedek is the name, and then he's referred to as the king of Salem. Well, that's the king of Shalom, the king of peace.
Yeah.
And then also the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, Malek Sadiq, king of righteousness. And so some people go, was that Jesus? Is this Abraham meeting the King of Peace, the King of Righteousness, as a pre-incarnate, meaning before he was born, Christ? And I think there's enough evidence in the Scripture to say that it is at least possible, if not likely, that Jesus does show up at intervals throughout the Old Testament. The question in particular has to do with Resurrection Sunday, with Easter Sunday and the stone being rolled away. And there, Sean, it was already in your premise. It was in kind of your clarifying question. Often the term, and you just pointed out one of those, was with Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord. And then Jacob saying, well, this is the face of God. I've wrestled with God, struggled with God and overcome. I think there is evidence there to show that the angel of the Lord often can be associated with a Christophany or a theophany. But that doesn't mean that every occurrence of the phrase, the angel of the Lord, because sometimes it is just a messenger of the Lord, an angel that's not the pre-incarnate Christ. And we know there's several of those angels. We know of at least Michael and Gabriel.
What was the one where it was like he was delayed?
That's later. It's in Daniel. Or spoiler alert. That's going to be later in Daniel.
That's what I thought it was Daniel.
And so we're not going to get ahead of ourselves on that one. But in that instance,
come to church every Sunday and you'll get to hear about that one.
Exactly. Yeah. Come show up again here in a few weeks. But yeah, so I think I would say the question as it's related to the resurrection is that in that instance, it would be my understanding that that's just an angel. It's not, this is not the spiritual Jesus rolling away the tomb so the physical Jesus can, that doesn't make sense to me. I think it's just an angel of the Lord, but not the angel of the Lord.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where I think because there's a lack of consensus, that when you see things like that in Scripture and you try to evaluate, I think the importance of, how important is it that we fully understand this? How important is it that we have an explanation for every single one of these occurrences? It seems that throughout the course of history, people who have interpreted the Bible, followed the way of Jesus, etc., have just determined that, hey, this isn't something that we're going to get completely hung up on either. It doesn't prevent us from following the way of Jesus. It doesn't prevent us from loving each other well. Not that to say it's not important to wrestle with these things and try to have an idea, but to come up with definitive statements that we know exactly this is this in every single case. There's a lot of things in the Bible, and as you work to try to interpret it, and as you work through theology, that there are often things that we hold in tension, often things that we can chalk up to mystery. We've talked about that on this podcast before, that part of following God is a willingness to embrace some mystery, and a willingness to understand that as people who are finite in our creation and in our minds, that we're not going to fully understand an infinite God, at least not in this lifetime. And so that this is something that I kind of put in that category.
Yeah, when we think about like unity jars or
Yeah.
all these things, this is one of the lowest levels. I mean, this is speculation, and it does not change the gospel. It does not change orthodox theology or doctrines. It doesn't change whether or not we can worship together. I mean, we're really getting into speculation and preference at this point. And so, not that it isn't a doctrine that, like you said, should be dialogued on. And you can, I don't even think it should be dialogued on. It could be dialogued on. I think it can enrich your understanding of a moment, but I don't think that it changes the meaning of the scriptures and what they're teaching in any way.
Yeah.
So, anyways, thank you for that question. That was a good question.
Thank you. All right, let's move on. We've got two other questions that are kind of in the same vein. They relate back to, one relates back to, I think, our last podcast or one of the last ones that we released. The other one came on the heels of a sermon where we kind of were talking about some things, but they both kind of express the same idea. I'll read the first one. We can give our response to that one and then maybe follow it up with the next one. So the one that was related to the last podcast, it said, it was talked about on the last podcast about not being fully conservative or liberal politically. And the question is, so then how can we continue to live in that third option or the third way? Because we said the way of Jesus does not conform fully to either of the dominant political ideologies in our culture. It's actually not a compromise or a middle ground in the middle of those two things. It's actually a third way. And so they're saying, how do we continue to live in that third way? And is it just through experience and conversation? I think I'll jump in with that one.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that, as I have read about this topic, as I've looked to practice it in my own life, as far as letting go of certain things, examining the ideologies of the world, the political ideologies of our culture, and holding those up next to what I understand to be the way of Jesus, that I've had to let go of certain things that even maybe I held previously. And I've had to be open to embrace other ways of living and seeing the world and understanding how to live. And so that sometimes is a difficult process, but I think it starts there. It starts with a willingness to examine our own lives, our own thoughts and structures on which those things are built, and a willingness to kind of hold those up next to the example that Jesus set. And then it's also helpful to look at, well, what did the early church do? How did they conduct themselves after having been with Jesus? And then in the subsequent kind of centuries, we have a lot of writings that kind of show like how that played itself out. And I think we have to be willing to do that, be willing to try to examine ourselves and look at that and say, okay, where do these things line up, and where do I maybe have to let go of some things and embrace something different? The other thing that I will say is I think that in our culture right now, it seems to be a demanding thing for us to add our voice to something. You know, the culture wars are raging. We have devices in our pockets where we can lend our figurative voice. You know, we can fire off a set of characters with our thoughts. And sometimes I think we feel that compulsion almost to like add something to the conversation, or to stand up for what we believe in, and to preach at other people, and to try to convince people with our arguments and our words. And where we see that going off the rails in our culture is that oftentimes it just devolves into personal attacks. It devolves into an us versus them mentality. And it's very, very tricky to enter that world where there's so much noise, and to think that, well, if I add my voice to the already existing noise, that it's somehow going to make a difference. And I really am becoming increasingly convinced that my call is not to do that. It's to be faithful to the way of Jesus in my marriage, with my friends, with my family, and with my neighborhood.
Now, how was the question worded again?
How do we continue to live in the third option or the third way, that doesn't, fall one side or the other on the political spectrum? And then they said, is it just through experience in conversation?
I see. I don't know that I was advocating that you could not be conservative, or you should not be conservative, or you should not be liberal. And that's what I hear that question asking. Like, and I wouldn't say that. I think you can live in that third way and be both of those things. Quite frankly, you could be either conservative or liberal. I think the idea is, for me, it's where is your identity? Like that's the heart issue is, am I finding my identity in being associated and known as, my reputation is known as a conservative, and people know me because that's how I articulate my thoughts and ideas and beliefs, and I stand up for this conservative idea or for this liberal idea, and it's not a moderate position that I think we're arguing for. I don't know if that question was really getting at that or not. My thing is, and I'm also not arguing that you have to be apolitical. That being a Christian means you have to be apolitical and you don't engage in that at all. Yeah, it's just, but what is the focus? Where is your identity found? Are you more concerned that you're known as a conservative or as a liberal or as a follower of Christ? And I think when your true identity, your whole identity is found in Christ, that will work its way out into one of those other things.
Yeah, the way I think through it is, I try to remove the word identity out of it, go a step removed from that, and just focus on personal values. Like, what are my absolute deepest personal core values in life, and are they in alignment with the political party, or are they in alignment with the way of Jesus? That's just how I think through it.
And then I get into a whole values virtues thing, because the values are individual, right? They're personal. And virtues are transcendent, right? They're beyond that. And so this is a whole big conversation. It's huge. I know I just cut you off. I didn't mean to cut you off, but it's interesting though.
Well, I mean, we see it in, we're going through this series in Daniel, and we see this with Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, hey, we're going to remove you from your homes and move you to another land. We're going to change your names. All these things are happening, and we don't see any resistance on their part against those things. It's like, hey, you're not really rubbing up against any of my personal, religious core values that I have here, or virtues. If that's the word you want to use.
Hold on, they're different. You know what? I'm sorry I brought it up.
But then it's, hey, we want you to eat this food that is non-kosher or has been sacrificed to idols or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's where they're like, oh, nope, we got to draw the line there. You can move us to another land, you can change our names, but we can't eat the same food that you're serving the king. I just think we have to, we as followers of Jesus have to wrestle with those things. Like, we are, in general, we get riled up and fired up over things that don't really matter that much. You would think, hey, Daniel moving to a new land, like, that matters a lot. Well, it does, but it still didn't hit the deepest convictions of his faith. And, I just think that Christians in general, we can get riled up about things that really just don't rub up against the deepest convictions of our faith. And
That's true.
And we have to be careful about that.
And I would say that I think my advice to anybody in this current culture would be, if you find yourself compelled to try to add to the cultural conversation, but you're not talking to your neighbor, and but yet you are on social media talking about what people you don't even know should be doing, what the government should be doing, what this group should be doing or shouldn't be doing, but you're not spending time getting to know your neighbor, your coworkers, and being a faithful presence around them, then you're looking to the wrong place to try to influence. Because very few of us are going to have influence beyond the sphere of people that we're regularly in contact with. Again, it's not to say be apolitical. It's not to say don't. But if that's the only place you're investing yourself is in the national news, and you're watching Fox or CNN or MSNBC, and you're all flustered because of what people you'll never meet and never talk to are doing and deciding, and you're not talking to your coworkers and your neighbors and getting to know them and living faithfully in front of them, then good luck having any influence. I don't think it's going to work that
And
way.
the odds
But
of-
we tend to, in our culture, look for top-down influence. Christianity's always been a grassroots movement. It has never grown through top-down leadership. It has never grown through gaining political power and influence and then letting that move there. Because you can make the argument, well, what about the Roman Empire? Well, the Roman Empire co-opted Christianity for its purposes, and that led to the downfall of it. What caused it to spread initially was a grassroots movement, people to people, living in the way of Jesus, inviting people into community. That's the way that it has always spread. And so I think it's a fool's errand to rely primarily on trying to influence people outside of our primary reach and influence, which is your neighbor, your coworker, your family. Be a faithful presence, love them, be a good representative of Jesus. That is where we will influence people.
Well, what I was going to say, the last part of that question, I think, is really the thing to talk about. Is it experience and conversations that help you to live out that third way? And I'd be interested to know exactly how that was meant. Because I don't. Certainly you can, as you have more conversations and experience in conversations, you can become more skilled at articulating your own ideas and perspectives. But actually, for me, if I'm thinking about how do I embody that third way through experience and conversations, to me, it looks like engaging, listening more than I talk, and then engaging in conversations with humility and patience.
Yeah.
And so that if that's what you're talking about, you mean experience and conversations, I think that's exactly right. Because, or just having, like you're saying, it's easy to attack an idea or a nebulous group of people out there that you are not interacting with face to face. That the reason that our political rhetoric has just gone off the charts in the last couple of years is because people aren't actually engaging with another person. They're engaging this nebulous, ethereal people out there. Those people out there. I'm going to use my platform on social media to say things against those people, but they don't have to look into an eyes of a person that they care about.
Yeah.
And that they actually have to have a meaningful conversation about. It's easy. So I was reading this week, Proverbs chapter 18. There's one of the verses in there. It says that a fool takes no pleasure or delight in understanding, but only in airing their own opinions.
Yeah.
And I think a healthy conversation requires understanding, and meaning you're not that you have an understanding of the elements of the issue and you're spewing your thoughts on that issue, but that you are seeking to truly understand another person and their position. And nobody's mind is changed when they're yelled at. Like that's very rarely the case. It's listening for understanding with humility and patience and then working through it. That takes a lot more patience and time.
When it comes to the internet, social media, the odds of you changing somebody's mind on the internet is very low.
Even in person, I would make a strong argument that you should be able to have a well-formulated idea of what serving Jesus is. You should be able to express that in conversation and understand other people. But even that, if you're not serving people, if you're not stepping in, serving the poor, if you're not extending service to your neighbor and your friends, and you're not willing to do that, then you can talk and talk and talk all you want and come to mutual understanding or agree to disagree. It's still not quite the way of Jesus, because the way of Jesus was to do those things, was to serve the world. And so I
The
think
people who disagreed with him.
yeah, anybody.
Yeah.
So I think that, I have to be careful because I can sound like I'm on my high horse, but I just think, talking is talking, and that's great. Jesus spent some time talking. He spent a whole lot more time serving people. And the disciples spent a whole lot more time growing the church by serving people than they did by talking about issues and giving well articulated responses to things. When the moment's right, you should be able to do those things. But what really I think will allow people to number one, believe that you believe what you're saying, is if they see that you're a loving person willing to reach out. Because, I mean, if we're talking about the right ideas about Jesus and what the world should look like, it's that we want to see a world full of people who love and care for each other, and that helps human beings flourish. But if people see us advocating verbally for a world like that, and then we're not lifting a finger to bring the kingdom of God to bear in the world,
Yeah.
then they're not going to believe that we even believe what we're saying.
That's right.
And I think that's part of the breakdown in some of the political stuff as well, is there are Christians on both sides of the political aisle who are great at espousing, hey, this is what it should look like, but nobody sees them actually doing any of it. They're just busy arguing about the best way. And I think humble service and being willing to just, like I said, be a little bit more person of character that people see living out something is far more compelling than any reasoned argument that I can give anybody. I'll get off my little soapbox there.
No, you're okay. So you said there were two questions.
Yeah.
What was the other question?
The other question is, with the way things are now, how do we as Christians influence our family, our community, and our leaders to recognize the value in following Jesus? I've reworded this a little bit because outside of most Christian homes, God is being removed from every aspect of our lives. And so we've kind of already touched a little bit on this. So I think that if I were to boil that question out, how do we be a faithful presence in the world?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're going through the series of Daniel. We see this in the person of Daniel very early on, but this week we're getting into, I think you're going to be teaching chapter 5. And at this point in time, it's been 65 or 66 years since Daniel was taken into captivity by the Babylonian Empire. So he's almost certainly in his 80s. And seemingly, he has just continued to live as a man of integrity, a person with that faithful presence. And, when the ruler has a problem, in this case, a dream that none of his wise people or sorcerers can interpret, he's like, oh, let's call on Daniel again. But I think Daniel just shows that integrity of just being that faithful presence throughout his life.
Yeah, we don't see him trying to overthrow things. We don't see him trying to assert himself to gain power. We don't see him trying to assert himself so that the powers that be even like change and follow Yahweh. But the interesting thing is, like, I love looking at Nebuchadnezzar's interactions, because it's like when he interacts with Daniel, it's like after each one of those, he has these moments where he sees God and he sees him kind of clearly, and he articulates some things where he recognizes God. And then he gets caught back up in his own stuff and his own pursuit of power and all of those things, and it kind of leads him away. But each time Daniel kind of is in the mix there with Nebuchadnezzar has some revelation. And I think in some ways that's the way it's going to work for us, that as people come into contact with us, the hope would be that they have some revelation of God that builds. And each time that they come into contact with me, I hope that somebody would say, "Oh, I have a little bit more of a glimpse of what God's like." And it may not be that they're in that moment they're going to make this radical decision to change their ways and understand everything fully, but maybe it's just that maybe it's the sum of those experiences with me and with other Christians that gives people a clear understanding. I think oftentimes that's probably the way it works, not just some big watershed moment where they have complete clarity and they surrender their life. I think oftentimes it's the consistent presence where each time they see us, they see a little bit of a revelation of who God is.
I think it's the thing that's been rattling around in my head during this question is this idea of just being fruitful wherever you're planted.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think part of that question assumes that like we're all supposed to be Daniels and we're all supposed to be Shadrachs, Meshachs, and Abednegos.
Well, you're a Daniel.
I am a Daniel. And so in the place in which I'm planted, I want to be fruitful. Thank you, Sean.
For those not watching on video and just listening to the audio right now, I'm shaking my head. I just want to say that.
But my thing is, God will place the people he wants to place in whatever positions he wants to put them in so that they will have a voice and be faithful where they are planted.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people want to be fruitful in places they have not planted. Well, that's just what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I think there are people who want to have influence in Washington, but they're not elected, and they think that the way to do that is through social media, right? Or through money, sending money support somewhere, or whatever that is. You want to be fruitful in places you haven't planted, and that doesn't even make sense, right? The idea is that God has planted you in a specific place within a specific group of people for a specific reason. And so not trying to be fruitful in places that you haven't planted, but be fruitful in the place where you are planted. Be fruitful, meaning, look, where you just said it, I'm just saying it a different way.
No, I think that's actually really great.
But being having a wherever your sphere of influence is, whether it's with your spouse, with your kids, with your coworkers, with your friends, with your neighbors, with your family of origin, wherever that is,
Yeah.
That's where God has planted you. These are the people he's given you influence with. This is where you use that influence to draw people to Jesus.
Yeah.
And don't worry about the rest. I just, I think that we all want to play God. We all want to think we know if we were God, we would influence these people this way. And that doesn't take into account the fact that there is a God who's already influencing people the way he wants to influence them. He's already in control.
Who has placed you exactly where you were, yeah.
And who's placed those people that you don't agree with exactly where they are.
Yeah.
And so to truly have that big view of God's sovereignty requires you to just trust him.
Yeah.
And to not try to be more than you are, but be faithful and be present and fruitful wherever you are.
That's good.
Amen.
Yeah. Hey guys, thanks for joining us. If you have any questions, you can submit them to us at the links below or give us a call and leave us a voicemail at the number. And like we said, we just want to be here to serve you and hopefully help you grow in understanding of how it is to follow Jesus and kind of what our thoughts and views are on that. So we thank you for joining us today. We'll see you soon.